Tomorrow, the Supreme Court is kicking off hearings discussing trans athletes. And not just athleticism, it goes deeper than that. So I'm going to explain everything and talk about it in this video. So we know there were no issues with trans athletes before Republican cult members started attacking out of nowhere. There is a planned attack of flooding trans people with legal attacks, which a lot of them have played out in court, and the wins are going to trans people because of the Constitution. But on January 13th, which is tomorrow, the court will weigh in on challenges to the constitutionality of laws in Idaho and West Virginia that prohibit trans women and girls from participating on women's and girls' sports teams. And that's not all. So there are two cases in the trans athlete discussion. The first is Little versus Hecox. This is Lindsay Hecox. She was a trans student at Boise State University who was impacted by Idaho's trans athletics ban in 2020. So there's that case. And then the other case is West Virginia versus Becky Pepper Jackson. Becky was in middle school at the time, and she was not allowed to try out for girls' sports because she's transgender. And this happened to her twice. And I also read Becky is the only trans athlete in West Virginia. So all of these attacks are literally on this one girl. Really, really sad. But good for her for fighting this. So last year, the Supreme Court decided to take up these two cases together. Both cases are represented by the ACLU, which is a civil rights legal organization. And so the final decision is expected around spring. So in both cases, the 4th and 9th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that in Idaho, the ban violates the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. It also ruled that the law violates Title IX, which is a federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in educational programs and activities that receive federal funding because it discriminates based on sex. So the outcomes of this, there are two scenarios for the outcome. The first, if the court rules that Title IX does not include prohibitions for discrimination on the basis of gender identity, specifically for sports or more broadly, it would allow these anti-trans sports bans to stand, to remain. Additionally, Title IX governs different types of sex-based discrimination beyond sports, including the use of people's names and pronouns, what bathrooms they can use, and what dress codes they have to adhere to, who they can take to prom, and even whether they can openly identify as LGBTQ or not. So therefore, undermining Title IX protections for trans people could create pathways for increased discrimination and exclusion in federally funded educational institutions for all LGBTQ people. So that's worst case scenario. So the second scenario, if the court rules that Title IX does include prohibitions for discrimination on the basis of gender identity in sports, both plaintiffs would win their challenges and the state bans, and others like them across the country would fall. So it's very important that we win this case, these two cases. So in these cases, we once again have the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a Project 2025 affiliated group that they were the ones that were involved in overturning Roe versus Wade. And I want to talk about this organization because they're the ones that are fighting against trans people being included. But it's really important we talk about the background of this organization. So Alliance Defending Freedom, they overturned Roe versus Wade. They want to overturn gay marriage. So they're anti-gay, anti-trans. They don't believe in free speech. They don't believe in abortion. They want to use Christian indoctrination in public schools and in government. They want Christian-only adoptions. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is a lawyer for this organization. Mike Johnson. They also wanted to ban COVID vaccines during COVID. They fought COVID regulations for large gatherings. So in other words, this is a fascist death cult directly related to the MAGA cult in government. I would even call this a terrorist organization. These people are fucking crazy and they're fucking stupid. It's been designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-LGBT hate group. This hate group is tax exempt and receives very large donations. The largest one I saw was $50 million. So that's why I say this is a fascist death cult. They're working directly with the government to implement their personal cult beliefs onto the public. Opponents have voiced concern about permitting churches to endorse politicians because it would allow political donors to remain anonymous and get tax breaks for their donations. That's exactly what I think is going on here. So in court, cult values are not legitimate. You can't discriminate in real society on a cult value. That's discrimination. Gender identity is protected under the Constitution, and further protections exist in blue states for gay and trans people. This attack from Republican cult members is part of a larger, darker, and more horrifying plan. Go watch my other videos on the trans genocide. That's very important. The attack started with releasing disinformation on trans people, specifically trans athletes and trans children. The intent was to spark fear, and it worked for a couple cult members, but we know from a study that cisgender women are not complaining about trans women in bathrooms. The attacks come from far-right cults and religious cults on the right. These people are extremely dangerous, violent, and anti-American. And not only that, but they don't recognize truth or reality. In reality, where non-cult members live, trans people are legitimate and proven by science to occur in nature. Same with gay, non-binary, and intersex people. So really quickly, let's go over some facts of trans athletes. Out of the entire country, there are only 10 trans college athletes. 10 out of 500,000 athletes, there are 10. So already, this is an extremely small pool of people. It equates to 0.002% of college athletes are trans, so virtually almost nothing. No trans person has ever won a medal in the Olympics, but they are allowed to compete, but that's also being debated right now. You will see a lot of disinformation coming from the right on trans athletes. One of the biggest lies is that trans women have a physical advantage. They will share small-scale, inaccurate studies to make their claims seem valid, but you have to look closer. Small-scale studies are wildly inaccurate if you know anything about science. The only recent large-scale study showed trans women were at a disadvantage to cisgender women, and that's because when you start hormones, which is required for a year before you be on an athletic team, your entire body changes. Your fat, your muscle, everything. The only thing that stays the same is bone structure. So trans people actually have a bigger skeletal frame on average with less muscle to support it.